And good morning. Okay, today's lecture is going to be a background lecture on a whole bunch of different kinds of topics and ideas we need to explore in the course of History 17A. And this is more or less designed to kind of give us the world historical, especially the European historical background to the efforts of colonization and exploration. And I set it up as this question of why explore then? And it says for colonization in the 15th and 16th centuries. Okay, so we are the beginning of the semester. I want to make sure that everyone kind of understands that when we say 15th century, we're talking about the 1400s. 16th century, 1500s. 21st century, 2000s. The reason for that, as most of you probably know, is that in the first century, say the year 44 CE, which is Common Era, the designation that has replaced BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini. If you are describing an event in the year 44 CE, Common Era, that's the first century. An event in the year 144 is in the second century. That's pretty easy to get, but I know there's a little bit of confusion for some of you less familiar with using terms like 17th, 18th centuries to refer to the 1600s and 1700s. So here we go. Here's the overview of what we're going to be looking at. Hopefully this will kick in. There we go. Takes a minute. So we'll go over a little timeline there of the Middle Ages. We'll talk about economic reasons, number one, for why they explored when they did. Political reasons for why European nation states explored the way they did. Intellectual reasons and religious reasons. And that will lead us into a little conversation about kind of the state of Christianity then and now. And we'll look at a little bit of contemporary data. And end with this so what sort of question. So going back up to our first category of reasons, economic reasons, nice fade in, huh? We want to recognize that there is, after the period of feudalism, after the early part of the Middle Ages, there's a commercial revolution and a revival of towns, trade, manufacturing that takes place in the High Middle Ages. And I want to kind of go back into this timeline here of, let me put me up in the corner, of showing us that the Middle Ages themselves, the early, high, late Middle Ages, all between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. And there's my obsession with 15th century, okay. So the Roman Empire doesn't really fall in 476, but historians have traditionally dated that as one of the moments when there's a transition in power in the Western Roman Empire. Of course, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, lasted for another 1,000 years. And to the extent that you can say that a lot of Western civilization is still based on Roman traditions, the Latin language, Christianity, Roman notions of republicanism, things like that, you can make a case that the Roman Empire never really fell. And I think in the early Middle Ages, people would, certainly the earlier parts of this, not necessarily perceive much difference in their lives here. Nevertheless, there is a precipitous drop in trade, in urban life, in the predictability and the protection of the roads and the trade that went on throughout the Roman Empire. And things kind of devolve into, well, devolve's a terrible word, but there's less imperial continental kind of trade going on and activity. So what a lot of people call the early Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, or the early part of it there. Most historians are not very comfortable with that term. But we can say that the feudal era, an era of breaking down society into more local kinds of political and economic divisions, is the hallmark of the feudal period of the early Middle Ages. You either owned land and were a lord, or some sort of militarized lord in the feudal relations of the feudal era, that is, that you provided military service to your lord in exchange for land. And then the manorial system at the local level, where peasants worked the land in return for protection from their local lord. All that is very local. And so you either have dukes, counts, earls, barons, various aristocrats that own the land, or you're among the 1 or 2% that are in the clergy praying for balance in the universe, or you're a worker, like 95% of the people who are either peasants or serfs, or in some cases slaves, but slavery will be less active in Western Europe, less by the High Middle Ages will be practically disappeared. Along about 1050, maybe about 1100 or so, we can talk about the High Middle Ages, the period from about 1100 to 1300, when, partially due to better weather, better developments in agriculture to produce more food, the population begins to recover. And not everyone has to be involved in food production in order for society to be able to feed itself, so that the more occupational specialization emerges in the High Middle Ages. More people begin to move into towns and revive manufacturing, and guilds are formed, and cities revive, and trade begins to revive during this period of the High Middle Ages here, from about 1100 to about 1300. The population of Europe will triple in those centuries. Now, the late Middle Ages is generally marked by a continuation of this urban trend, but marred by famines, worse weather, sometimes called the Little Ice Age, the Black Death, the bubonic plague that killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe in 1349, 1350, and periodically over the next couple centuries it comes back. But in the mid 14th century, it just walloped the population of Europe. And then you begin to get a revival in the Renaissance, starting in Italy around 1400, but really in the rest of Europe around 1500 or so. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about economic reasons for why they explored when they did. This revival of towns, trade, manufacturing within these towns like Chartres in central France, just west of Paris, that is wealthy enough to build these cathedrals that found universities in Italy and France and England in the High Middle Ages. All that represents the rise of the interests of the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, as Marx called them, the people who are not serfs or landlords, but are in fact traders, merchants, guild members, small manufacturers, but people that are trading goods. And it's this rise of the middle class, the business interests of Western Europe, that are going to be the principal uh, social group pushing for voyages of exploration to get access to more markets, to avoid the middlemen of especially the trade with the Far East that had developed during the entirety of the Middle Ages. So the emergence of this new class of people, the bourgeoisie, the middle classes, becomes one of the most important reasons for why they explored when they did. They didn't explore before this economic transformation, and they did as that economic shift was paralleled by certain political developments, mostly the consolidation of the power of kings into nation states. And so I've got a nice picture here of Joan of Arc, who is principally responsible for having the French nation state emerge intact and with centralized power in about 1430 or so, at the end of the near the end of the 100 Years' War with England. But these three nation states, what we usually call countries, England in 1066, France in the mid 15th century, Spain when Ferdinand and Isabella marry and unite Castile and Aragon in the Iberian Peninsula of Spain. This political consolidation is a necessary precondition for the voyages of exploration because countries, governments funded them. And those kinds of governments with those kinds of interests just didn't exist in the early Middle Ages. So this evolution of a nation of people, we talk about, the American people or the American nation, or we talk about the French nation. Generally, that's a cultural kind of understanding that we're talking about the people that make up this nation, which is a larger body than a tribe or a band of peoples, and smaller than the whole world. Precise definition. That as nations of people that share a common culture, a common identity, a common sense of national identity, usually built around the language and religion that they share, but fostered by common folklore, common tradition, common sense that they've gone through history together. It helps to shape a national identity. And so that cultural unit of a nation becomes kind of newly invigorated in terms of its self-awareness in the High Middle Ages. It's matched by the development of a nation state, of countries that are the political manifestation of a nation of people. When that nation of people have a government that can defend the boundaries of the nation of people and can function along the lines of what we expect modern governments to do, that is to coin money and establish weights and measures and develop a bureaucracy where you start to formalize the actions of the government, conduct diplomatic relations with other nation states. All these trappings of political centralization occur in these three nation states, starting in England in the 11th century with the Norman conquest. Easy, Leonardo. And what happens are these two bullet points in the middle here, in competition with the interests of the lords and in cooperation with the middle classes, with the bourgeoisie, is what helps to grease the wheels of the evolution of the nation state, of countries. Kings tended to be the most powerful, the liege lord in the feudal aristocratic order, and they were always in competition with the other lords coming out of that, the people with their own private armies and castles and medieval knights serving one interests of one of the lords. Yeah, usually they're going to be the group that is most opposed to the consolidation of power in the hands of a king or in the nation state. Whereas the business interests, the bourgeoisie, are almost always in alignment with a political centralization. Of course, if you're a French business person, you don't want to have to pay taxes on the goods that you're trying to move around France to 18 different lords that might tax them as they go through their provinces. You might want to see one tax paid to one king who is therefore going to sponsor and help protect the unification of the French economy. So I guess this unification of business and political interests in the form of rising nation states ushers in what most of us would recognize as, you know, kind of the hallmarks of modernity, the marriage of business, corporate now, and government interests. And that's a relatively new phenomenon. And like I said earlier, it's only because you have those governments ready then to fund someone like Columbus with his stupid idea of how big the earth was, but his smart idea about the shape of that earth. And they took a flyer on him and gave him 3 ships. Who did? Queen Isabella of Spain. Okay. You also get the Renaissance, the intellectual context for exploration. And a lot of that is wrapped up in the navigational advancements of the 15th century. Astrolabes and compasses and rudders on ships and sails that can, you know, tack against the wind, the adaptation of Chinese and Arab sailing techniques in European ships. All of that kind of comes together in the kind of navigational advancements of the 15th century, led especially by the Portuguese under Prince Henry the Navigator and the Spanish, who were building in turn on the advanced trading techniques of the Italian city-states in the High Middle Ages. But the spirit of questioning, the secularism, the individualism, the sense in the Renaissance that people could figure things out if they went back to the source and applied ideas differently. And the whole role of the printing press in spreading the awareness of these new scientific and navigational advancements. The printing press comes out of Germany, movable type. In the 1460s are the first printing presses. And then by the 1480s, 1490s, there are a lot of printing presses, creating a community of scholars and scientists, as we might start to call them, who are all motivated by this spirit of the Renaissance, the spirit of questioning, this drive to expand human knowledge. And that helps to account for why that is part of the mix as to why Europeans explored after the Renaissance had begun to take hold in Europe. And finally, you thought I'd never get there. Finally, there are the religious reasons that enter into this story. And I think I can, to a huge extent, the religious theme here is more important in terms of explaining how colonization evolved the way it did, why rival European nation states who by 1600, 1550 are practicing different brands of Christianity. It more explains colonization than it explains exploration. But I would just say that the spirit of the Reconquista, the Spanish several hundred-year-old effort to wage war against the Muslims, against the infidels, against the Moors of Spain, justified the idea of a holy war, as the Crusades had done centuries before. And this is kind of another militarized version of spreading Christianity. But it explains why someone like Cortez can, conquer the Aztec Empire and absolutely be certain that converting the Native Americans to Christianity, to Roman Catholicism, was absolutely the moral and justified thing to do, to prevent all of the people of the New World from being condemned to hell. The Reconquista fired Spanish nobility and Spanish common people with this sense of religious conquest, and that it's a moral good, and that by converting people to Catholicism, you were giving them a chance to have a future in heaven, is how a lot of them saw it. I'm not saying this is anything more than an explanation for how Cortez could approach the Aztecs in the way that he did, a militarized, but still morally cocksure sense that what they were doing was ultimately the right thing. And for most of us, that confounds our sense of logic. Now, this fellow here, Martin Luther, in 1517, began the Protestant Reformation. And in order for us to kind of understand just the basics of his impact on American history, we want to look at the whole idea of Christianity itself that had evolved over the years. Jesus sorry, let me start over. This is hopefully a 5-6 minute version of how to explain Christianity. Jesus, almost all historians are convinced, existed in Judea, a province of the Roman Empire, sometime born probably, most people think, around the year 4 BCE. There was a slight miscalculation that put his birth in the year 1, which is why the calendar system that evolved in the 8th century based on the birth of Jesus and not on the era of the Roman consul or the Greek Olympiad, other dating techniques. The Muslim world, of course, dates the year 1 from the date of Muhammad's journey to Medina in 622. That's their year 1. Okay. Common Era says Jesus was born around the year 1. People that believe in Jesus are called Christians. Boom. That's the fundamental term that we're going to be using. It's a fraught term in the sense that, what do they believe about Jesus? I think for most Christians, there's a sense of his divinity, of Jesus as both human and divine. But there's a lot of fudging around all that. So I like this very silly and very broad definition of Christians as someone who believes in Jesus. Okay. Immediately in the Roman Empire, there were different urban centers of Christian communities who had different leaders. The cities of Jerusalem, of Antioch, of Damascus, of Alexandria, and of, eventually Constantinople and Rome, all had powerful churches with powerful leaders, usually called a bishop, who organized the Christian communities in these urban enclaves in the Roman Empire between, let's say, 40 CE and 240 BC. The slow growth of the Christian community, especially in urban Roman communities, was the hallmark of the spread of the early church. Now, not surprisingly, the head of the Roman church, the Bishop of Rome, is going to assume a lot of power. And in the tradition of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, their first bishop was St. Peter, the apostle of Jesus, who is, according to Catholics, designated by Jesus to be the leader of the church on earth. And so every bishop of Rome has been a pope, from St. Peter through to the present. The Bishop of Constantinople, the other major, most important city in the Roman Empire, was the leader of a slightly different tradition of Christian practice that we generally called Orthodox and still call Orthodox. Eastern Orthodox, eventually Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, but the Orthodox tradition goes back to the 1st century. And the Roman Catholic. Catholic is a word that means universal. They claim to be the universal Christian church. Church goes back to the 1st century. And for the next 1,400 years, those churches evolved and became bigger and bigger, and became the kind of leading centers of organized Christian faith in Western civilization. Now, there are other splinter groups out there, but basically that's what you have, are Roman Christians, Roman Catholics, and Orthodox traditions. In 1517, Luther challenged some of the teachings of the church, of the Catholic Church, some of the practices. He thought it was, for instance, wrong to go around selling indulgences that were forgivenesses of sins that would get you into heaven. Luther read the Bible and thought that it said that you cannot buy your way into heaven. It says the opposite of that. And so what he began as what he hoped to be a series of debates and a discussion within the church with the goal of church reform turned into a rebellion within 3 or 4 years. And he made a break with the church, and the church made a break with him. And from 1520 till 1648, Europe was involved in a series of wars between Catholic forces and Protestant forces. A Protestant is someone who comes out of the Western Christian tradition. That would be the Roman Catholic tradition. But in 1517, a number of splinter groups in the West began to form. First, the Lutheran Church in Germany, and then the Calvinist Church in Geneva, Switzerland, and Calvinism took root in lots of other places. And the Anglican Church, the Church of England in the 1530s, as Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce, the Pope wouldn't give it to him, so he gave himself his own divorce and called himself the head of the Church of England. Those are the 3 big early Protestant churches, but today there are dozens and dozens of Christian churches that are Protestant. And Protestants will be, in general, the kinds of folks that dominate American history in History 17A. So if you're a Christian on the planet today, you are almost certainly going to be either Roman Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant. And I want to illustrate that. Now, here's the map that shows more or less how Europe evolved in the 80 years or so after Luther. Most of Europe remains Catholic, this yellowy part. Northern Germany and Scandinavia become Lutheran. There's Calvinist enclaves in Switzerland and southern Germany, the Netherlands, and Scotland. And here's you see where the Scots moved to Northern Ireland. And the English become Church of England, And here, of course, is the Orthodox holdings or region in Eastern Europe, and Muslims dominate, of course, what we now call the Middle East and North Africa, with lots of splinter groups all over. That's kind of the map of Christianity then and now. I found these in some recent, mostly Pew Research websites, showing today the percentage of Christian population that is Catholic, that basically follows the Pope, is just above 50%. All the Protestant churches are about 37%. The Orthodox tradition has about 12% of all the Christians on the planet today. This chart is just kind of astonishing to give you some sense of the regional distribution of Christians. And the fact that, well, yes, Christianity used to be a faith that was dominated by Europeans, and then the Americans being an important part of Christianity. But look how Christianity, Sub-Saharan Africa and the Asia Pacific region, places like the Philippines, have skyrocketed as a proportion of the world's Christian population, and how that's shifted how we think about Christians or Christianity today. And then this shows the 10 countries with the largest number of Christians, and you'll see that as a percentage, okay, you can see how the United States, Brazil, Mexico, and Russia have a huge number of Christians, and then how that works out as a percentage of the population that is Christian. And still, it's I think, important in godless Santa Cruz for us to recognize that 80% of the United States population is still Christian. And that's a fairly significant number. And you can see, obviously, in Latin America and places like the Philippines, the Congo, what a huge percentage of the population is Christian today. And then I think this is my second last, we'll get there, contemporary chart showing the 15 largest Protestant denominations. So after Luther, every church that emerges is generally called Protestant. And if you look at this, Southern Baptist is the largest Protestant faith, in America, but Methodists, other Baptists, evangelicals, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Church of God, Seventh-day Adventists, United Church, all these kinds of things, Quakers, Mennonites, Amish, whatever, all of them are Protestant. And most of the churches that you drive by in the United States are some form of Protestant faith, although the Catholic tradition in the 20th and 21st century is mushrooming. This gives you a regional sense of where the Baptists are, the Southern Baptists, where the Lutherans are up in Scandinavian settled northern tier of states, and Methodists in this green swath here. I kind of think about this as kind of a fascinating thing. I'm sure some of you are going to hit pause on your replay button just to study this. This obviously shows the United States in divisions of counties, and then the dominant church there. So we were a hugely Protestant-dominated culture in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. The bulk of our course will be looking at those Protestant Americans. And Catholicism has made a huge gain as a percentage of Christians in the United States in the last 120 years. Significantly, why Europe explored then helps to explain how Europe took over the planet by 1600, made Christianity the largest religion in the world, whereas before 1490, it was not as large as the Muslim religion was in the world. So that's going to be of huge, world historical significance, this era of exploration and colonization. It was not China. China might have led the push for exploration. China actually sent 200 ships to Africa in the 1417, 1418 in the Zhenge expedition, and they were not sufficiently impressed with the trade possibilities to reshape the trading patterns that they were already involved in. Kind of the same thing with the Ottoman Empire, which was making a lot of money off the Silk Road trade and their intra-Ottoman kind of trade. Each of these political organizations, China and the Ottoman Empire, were more powerful than all of the countries of Europe put together in the 15th century. But it was the competition among these smaller European countries and the rivalries that they were internalizing because of the political and economic changes that had recently happened and the religious rivalries that had become part of their DNA by 1550, that helped to spur the voyages of exploration. So just basically review questions here about the economic, social, political, and intellectual and religious reasons for why Europeans explored when they did, and some of the social implications of the Reformation as a religious movement for United States history. And we'll be looking at those things over the course of the semester. Okay. Thank you much. Bye-bye.